Thank you so much for the invitation. This is a great honor to be in the Institute. I'm on the mailing list, so I know everything what is going on here, and it's truly the privilege to have that opportunity to speak to you. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is to talk about patterns of transformations in Eastern Europe, patterns of democratization in Eastern Europe, but in the very special theoretical context. When we look at literature in comparative politics over the last 2 decades, there is clearly today change in the way people think about understanding processes of democratization. The old models, the old approaches, the old ideas somehow do not work. And so we are at this, very special moment when there is a big shift of paradigm. And what I'm going to tell you would be an example of why do we need this shift of paradigm and what that new paradigm, can mean, really. So before I start talking about more theoretical issue, let me introduce East European transformations to you a little bit. When process of change started in Eastern Europe in 1989, there was this common, very pessimistic view that those countries have been burdened by the communist system for such a long time that the chances of building working democracy and chances of building market economy in that region are very low. Janjaweed, exemplifies that point of view in the best way, saying that those countries are going to struggle with the legacy of the communist rule for many, many years. But the most surprising thing, 20 years after, is that many of the East European countries were incredibly successful in building democracy and building market economies. And other East European countries were not very successful in building markets and democratic system. So I think, the puzzle is really why, coming from the same place, those countries moved in so many different directions. Right? So the puzzle, in a sense, is why the communist legacy Janjaweed pointed to in his early article was not important for some countries. And that brings me, just for a short footnote, in theoretical dimension. Social sciences were very effective and very efficient studying social change. We have serious problem in studying continuities. Professor Clemens wrote a wonderful article a few years ago exploring the issues, asking the question why we are interested in change, why you are interested so much in change. When you look at the comparative politics literature or political sociology literature, we study regime change, we study revolutions, we study big crises, regime transformation, welfare state transformation, everything is about change. But we have very little to say about persistence, durability, continuity, and so on. So that's going to be a major sort of theoretical underpinning of what I'm planning to say today. Now, I will focus on those issues in 3 steps. So I first look at the idea of the communist legacy, what it is and what consequences it should have. Then I will quickly look at the outcomes of post-89 transformations, and then I will try to suggest the ways of thinking about explaining those outcomes. I have 30 slides, but I'm going to go very quickly through those slides so we have time for the discussion. So when scholars were talking about the communist legacy, they usually emphasize three things. The communist legacy should be similar to all the countries which had the communist regimes, right? So this question of similarities of starting conditions. Then the point was emphasized that those legacies are very powerful, very difficult to undo, and very difficult to overcome. And then finally, the third point about legacies were that they are very unfriendly to democracy and market economy. And those legacies usually were grouped in three different, under three different headings, right? So first of all, a lot of scholars pointed out that there is a lot of missing preconditions for democracy and markets in Eastern Europe, right? So there are no entrepreneurial classes, very weak middle classes. There are no market institutions. The property rights are not there. There is no institutional infrastructure for market economy. The democratic tradition is weak in many of those countries, and so on, so on. So one could conclude that in the case of the absence of those preconditions, it would be very difficult for those countries to build democracy and build market economy. And then some people made additional assumptions about kind of people who lived under communist regimes, right? This is a title which comes from the book of the very influential Russian novelist who called that person living under communist regime Homo Sovieticus. And the Homo Sovieticus was the person with very high welfare expectation, non-entrepreneurial at all. This was a person very suspicious of authority. This was a person which did not have trust in others who lived in the same society, and so on. So it was a very peculiar set of psychological characteristics, which of course meant that those people were not equipped, did not have endowments and resources to be citizens in democratic countries or to be active entrepreneurial participants of the market economy. And finally, the third set of specific descriptions of those communist legacies were about everyday resistance. This goes back to James Scott's idea of forms of resistance under non-democratic rule, and simply signifies the big amount of corruption, low trust, disregard of law, and so on and so on. Right? So these were the legacies which scholars pointed to at the beginning of the transition. And then when they started to think about what are the consequences of that kind of legacies, they had a very pessimistic view of the future of Eastern Europe. So they either said that, you know, those countries will look like Latin America more than Western Europe, that those countries will return to their tradition of authoritarian regimes, or those countries will reach an equilibrium but at very low level. Right? Bela Greskovic, our dear friend who is in Seoul today, made that argument that those democracies are going to be low-performing democracies, and those market economies are going to be a very sort of badly working with, you know, skewed redistribution, big state-owned components, and so on and so on. Right? So communist legacies led to those pessimistic views of the future of Eastern Europe. Now, okay, so it's 20 years later, and let's see where things are today. So this is a Freedom House index, which we use to measure, by and large, the quality of democracy. It's not perfect. We all use it because it's very convenient. But it shows some very interesting regularities. And the most interesting thing among all is that there are dramatic, significant differences between sub-regions of Eastern Europe. Groups of countries which they all came from the communist regime, but 20 years later landed up in completely different spots in terms of quality of their democratic systems. So, for example, the countries of Central Europe and the Baltic republics, I here think about countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Hungary. Those countries made tremendous progress in a very short period of time and reached the level of quality of democracy which is equal to the level of West European and Southern European countries, right? You know, in a very interesting way, the scores for Central Europe are even higher than scores for Southern Europe, by which I mean Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Now, the second group of countries are the countries of Southeastern Europe, right? These are the Balkan countries, Romania, Bulgaria, and the republics of the former Yugoslavia. So as you see here, the progress was not very fast as it was in Central Europe. And of course we know why, because there was a war in the former Yugoslavia at the beginning of the transition. So those scores were really suppressed. But then even with the war ending and peace returning to the region, that transition did not reach the heights of Central Europe. Now, that line are the countries of the former Soviet Union, except for the Baltic republics, and this line are the countries of Central Asia. So as you see, in the span of 20 years, there is this dramatic difference, dramatic diversity of the quality of democracy which emerged in the former bloc of communist countries. But the same situation emerges when we look at other indicators as well. It's not only about democracy. Here, the example are the governance indicators. Again, there's another index produced by the World Bank, which shows pretty much the same picture, right? So again, these are the countries of East Central Europe, and the scores in the governance indicators are relatively high. Here, the green ones are the countries of Southeast Europe. Again, you know, Bulgaria, Romania, and the former post-Yugoslav republics. And then is the group of countries which now are the part of which were the part of the former Soviet Union in the past. And then Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan are at the very end. So again, you know, when we look, that index shows us the effectiveness of the government, how well the governments operate, how well they follow the rule of law, control corruption, and so on and so on. One more example, and that goes to the idea of civil society. Now here, you know, it's a very simple graph which try to approximate the quality of public space. It looks at political freedoms, freedoms to set up organizations and protection of different civil rights, and it looks at the freedom of press index, which tell us something about how free the media in a given country are. And again, we have those four groups of countries which emerged from the Soviet Union and communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and we see pretty much the same pattern, right? So Central Europe in the period between 1994 and 2006 made this move in improving the quality of public space, and now it's very close to the level of and the quality in Western Europe. Southeast Europe made a big progress as well during that period, but it's, you know, quite far from where Western Europe and East Central Europe is. The countries of the former Soviet Union, like Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, moved down. So the quality from 1994 to 2006 declined, and then those countries didn't move in neither direction. There is no public space in those countries. They were not in 1994, and there is no public space in 2006. And one more graph, which again shows that same situation. This is another index I'm using to illustrate the dynamic of transformations. This is Ngo Sustainability Index, which describes the conditions for civil society organizations. It deals with registration procedures, with funding, with other things. And again, you know, very similar picture. Central Europe is very high in this index. Balkan countries are here, and again the Russia and Ukraine are here, and the Central Asia and Caucasus are here. So whatever set of indicators you look at, the situation is by and large the same. And not only with indicators which describe the political and social situation, but in economic terms, there is gigantic difference today as well, right? So when you look at the GDP per capita, you see that, you know, the GDP in those countries ranges from over $25,000 for Slovenia to all the way down to, you know, like 2,000 or something for Moldova. So we have this variety not only of political outcomes, but we also have incredible variety of economic outcomes. So the first point I would really like to emphasize is that there is this tremendous variation 20 years into the transformation in Eastern Europe for countries which started from the relatively similar point. Now, the second point I would like to make about this is slightly different. Now, when you look at those indicators which I showed over time, one of the most striking thing about this is that there is no convergence between those groups of countries, right? So the lines go, you know, this is over a 10-year period. You know, the lines go in parallel way. You know, I'm using the governance, the components of the governance index here to show that that pattern. Okay, so rule of law. Basically no change. I mean, it's not surprising that there is no change in Western Europe, right? But it's quite surprising that there is no change in other parts of the former Soviet bloc. You could imagine that, you know, some countries could make progress. There's a lot of resources, there is a lot of policy help, there is a lot of, you know, really know-how and resources transfer from EU to different countries in Southeastern Europe and so on. But somehow this does not seem to work. Government effectiveness, again, it's the same thing. You know, you see the parallel lines going on. One more slide, control of corruption. It's the same, there is no progress, there is no conversion between groups. Quality of regulations. You know, we could ask why. You know, it's easy to learn, right, how to produce the high quality regulations, but somehow, you know, those things do not change. Okay, so two things. Diversity and lack of convergence is what really characterizes the transition from communist rule in Eastern Europe. So the question is that we probably should not speak about communist legacy, right? This is a quotation from influential French scholar and commentator on Eastern Europe, who says that, you know, the fact that those countries were communist at a certain point seems not to matter anymore. Some are dictatorships today, others are fully consolidated democracies, some are fully working market economies, others are sort of semi-centralized, still very much communist economic system. So for certain reason, that common communist legacy is not important. And that fact defies the predictions or ways of thinking which were very important in analyzing the first years of transition in Eastern Europe. So when you think about the literature from the first decade of economic transformations, the diversity of outcome was explained by many different factors, right? Many of them very close to the outcome, one would say. So, you know, people were making an argument that being part of the Soviet Union was really bad, because the communist system lasted for a long time, and the communist policies were really, you know, much more aggressive than they were in any other countries. But then you have the Baltic republics, which were part of the Soviet Union, and they were doing, you know, incredibly well. Now, some arguments were that, you know, having orthodox communist regimes is not good for democratic and economic transformations. You know, people were saying that Poland, Hungary are on the path to democracy and market economy because they did not have the orthodox communist regime in place. But again, you know, Czechoslovakia was very orthodox communist country, and somehow managed to move alongside with Poland and Hungary as a very successful reformer. Being independent of the Soviet Union also was not very important, right? Romania was independent from the Soviet Union, and that meant very little. This is not incredibly successful country. And then, of course, being independent reformer may not be an advantage because of the example of Yugoslavia, right? So you know, these are the examples of existing explanation and factors people emphasized when they were trying to explain that variety of outcomes. Now, it seems to me that because the common communist legacy does not explain diversity of outcomes, we should look for inspiration somewhere else. Now, here are two quotations from two very famous scholars. One is a historian, one is an economist. And both of them are making a very simple point. The change in societies doesn't happen quickly. The change in societies takes decades and centuries to evolve. That once some conditions are set in place, then it's very difficult to undo those conditions and to change it. Fernand Braudel famously called that the longue durée, and thought about this as sort of underlying set of preferences which are in place and stay in place for a very long period of time. So what I'm trying to suggest, and this is clearly way in which the current literature in East European studies is moving, is that we should pay much more attention to the long historical trends instead of short-term changes and short-term trends. Let me give you an example of it. Now, this is a result of presidential elections in Poland in 2005. There were two candidates, one from the liberal camp who won that part of Poland, and one from sort of conservative nationalist camp who won that part of Poland. Then 2 years later, there were parliamentary elections. So the party of that candidate who was liberal won the elections in this part of Poland. And then the second candidate, the conservative nationalist one, won election in this part of Poland. Okay, so What is going on? Why we have that strange distribution across this very funny line? Okay, this is a map of Europe in 1871. Poland is not on that map because Poland did not exist at the time. And here is that line which distinguishes the Russian Empire from the German Empire. Okay, let's do the experiment. Okay, here is that line, right? And here is that electoral map. Okay, Poland became independent in 1919. And during that 100 years from the imperial past, Poland went through two gigantic wars which decimated populations with big population transfers. Went through two processes of industrialization, one in the intra-war period, but then the second one, even more important, you know, the industrialization under communist regime, where economic structure was set upside down, right? The old property rights were destroyed, property was nationalized, new industries were built, and so on and so on, right? So when you think in terms of traditional political sociology, those societies should look completely different. Their economic structure, their political structure, their educational structure, everything was completely changed, reworked, and moving completely different direction. But somehow that border, which doesn't exist since the end of the 19th century, is still there in preferences people have in elections. Okay. This is the number of NGOs in the countryside in Poland. So, you know, the point I'm making is not, you see that border not only in political preferences. You see that border in other things. Why here you have many fewer NGOs than you have over there? 100 years after that border disappeared. Okay, one more example. All right, when you look at the income per capita in Eastern Europe, in the intra-war period, the ranking is this, right? You know, Czechoslovakia was the richest country, then was Hungary, then Poland, then Romania, then Bulgaria. You look at this 70 years later, after war, communism, industrialization, and other things, and the ranking is exactly the same. So how is it possible that in 70 years with so many opportunities, none of those countries could really change position, right? Why none of those countries became, I don't know, South Korea or Taiwan, tiger, and move ahead, you know, from the old conditions? Now, mind you, it's pretty much the same in Western Europe. There is no dramatic change of economic rankings over the 70-year period. And the same situation is in Latin America. You know, one of the Latin American scholars wrote this wonderful paper showing that for the last 400 years, basically, the ranking of Latin American countries has been staying the same, except for, you know, things like discovery of oil in Venezuela, which sort of boost the position of Venezuela a little bit. But so again, you know, it's a puzzle why certain things, despite incredible amount of change, keep staying the same. Okay, so how should we explain that? What are the options we as social scientists have to think about this? That's, by and large, is the menu of options we have, right? So there's a big literature on economic backwardness and underdevelopment. That literature is not very popular today, but you know, in 60s and 70s, it was, you know, the height of popularity for that literature, right? So there are those vicious cycles and virtuous circles. So when country comes into a vicious one, it may take decades to recover, or maybe never, right? So when the certain dynamic is set in place, then we are stuck. And regardless of what happens, we are in the same position 100 years later. Now, the second possibility is to think in terms of social capital. Right? That there is a certain amount of social capital in different locations, and then it tends to persist. The famous book on Italy makes exactly that point. Right? So in northern Italy, through a long historical process and through a couple of historical accidents, a lot of social capital emerged. And in contrast to southern Italy, this has been causing tremendous disparity between north and south. Right? So that's another possible explanation. Now, the third possible explanation comes from Max Weber, and it's about cognition and caging and so on. There is, you know, a lot of scholars work with this idea that you know, the moment certain cages are established, it's very difficult to break out of it. Of course, it goes back to the influential Weber work on Protestant ethic. Right? The question is, you know, the argument in this book is that certain quality of Protestantism had elective affinity to capitalism, right? But then someone asked the question, okay, so the fact that the, you know, Calvinists in the Netherlands had this problem with God, which forced them to work very hard. Why a Catholic who moved to Holland 200 years later should do the same, right? And that's the idea of caging, right? So, you know, the iron cage for Weber was that situation that when the certain institutions are set up once, then, you know, they persist, right? Then they don't need that initial connection, but they are forcing other people who have nothing to do with beliefs to behave exactly the same way. Brodel has the idea of mentalities, and again, you know, we can think about this, that mentalities are moving slowly and they exist for long periods of time and they're very difficult to change, so that may be another mechanism of change, of persistence, right? Informality, that's probably another possibility. So there may be a lot of formal change. You know, institutional changes, reforms, imagine the communists moving in, abolishing different institutions and so on, but because informality is such an important part of social reality, the old ideas are transformed, are persist and are sort of, you know, transferred from generation to generation in informal ways. Okay, so let me give you an example. Ivan Seleny, a Hungarian sociologist who is at Yale, wrote a wonderful book about entrepreneurs under the communist regime. So, with the reforms in Hungary in the 70s and 80s, there were opportunities for people to become private entrepreneurs. And indeed, a lot of those people emerged and became private entrepreneurs. So Ivan asked, okay, who are those people? Who are those people who, under the communist regime, which discourages entrepreneurial activities, are clever enough and brave enough to become private entrepreneurs. So he took the samples of those entrepreneurs, and he looked at what their parents did, right? He thought that maybe, they come from specific families. And of course, there was no correlation between entrepreneurial activities and what parents did. Some were lawyers, some were teachers, some were others, and so on. But then he went one generation down and looked what the grandparents did. And there was significant correlation. The grandparents were the entrepreneurs 50 years earlier. So despite the fact that the parents did completely different things, somehow those entrepreneurial preferences and the knowledge somehow survived there and then emerged 50 years later when conditions change in the Hungarian society. So we can think about informality as a mechanism of change. And then finally, there is this possibility that we are imagining all of that, right? That we are constructing reality in a certain way, and that construction of reality is done by entrepreneurial politicians who shape the preferences of people and so on. I like to use in this context the idea which comes from the very famous Polish journalist who was trying to understand why so quickly in Russia some Tsarist traditions which were killed and died almost 100 years earlier emerged after Russia became non-communist country. So he said, well, there is this very strange effect. Lapidarium is a room in the museum where museum people keep pieces of junk, basically. For example, the finger from the ancient statue. Well, you cannot display the finger of the ancient statue. It's not a very interesting thing. But also you cannot throw away the finger from the ancient statue, right? Or, you have a chair which is 600 years old and it's broken. Well, you cannot really display that, but you cannot really throw that away, right? So the lapidarium is a junkyard in which the old things, broken, destroyed, sit. Now, he describes transition as a moment in which someone opens the door to that junkyard, and then very entrepreneurial people come in and take bits and pieces of everything and create something new. Right? So you think that this is old because the bits and pieces are old, but in fact this is not. This is construction. This is something which the entrepreneurs have done. Right? So here are the possible explanation. And let me move to my last slide. Somehow to think about this once more in a more systematic way. So I really want to make a point that longue durée, long historical legacies matter in a very profound way. And we need to figure out, as social scientists, how they matter and what are the mechanisms through which they matter. Right? Now, I call this palimpsest problem. Palimpsest is this sort of, in feudal Europe, when paper was very expensive, the monks sometimes erased writing in the old manuscripts, and then new things were written on the same pages. Right? You couldn't see that there was something written there unless you have instruments to see that. So now, when you do the sort of X-ray today, you see that, you know, there was a text out there, and then someone wrote a new text on the top of it, right? You know, people do the same things with paintings, right? You know, you do the X-ray of paintings and you discover that, you know, that long missing painting of a famous artist was just simply painted over, right? So that's palimpsest, right? Something which had text before and then the text disappeared, but not entirely. If you have the right tools, you can see what was there before, right? Now, okay, so if we take this idea seriously, what do we need to do? You know, the first thing which we need to do is to think about social reality in a holistic way. We have to think about this reality in such a way that as great 19th century theorists did, like Karl Marx and others, that it has layers. Some layers are more permanent than other layers. Some layers are more important than other layers, and so on, right? So for Marx, for example, you know, the most important layer were those sort of forces of productions, the economic factors. And then, you know, the political institutions were less important layer. So you could change political institutions, but, you know, those economic forces really work there. So we have to think in essentialist way in order to be able to understand that kind of processes. Now, the second thing we need to do is to move away from the current borders. You know, these are completely artificial creations. As that, you know, what is the real border in Poland? Is it that one which is the current political border? Or is that one which goes across the country, which divides country into two really very different entities where people are organized differently, have different preferences and so on, right? So we need to cross artificial state borders of the modern states and look at the regions or civilizations which were connected in one way or disconnected in one way or another for the long period of time. Now, then we need to think seriously about what that longue durée continuities mean, right? And again, you know, we just cannot think about this in Brodelian sense as mentalities underlying everything, but as social scientists we want to think about this as interacting threads of continuity, right? Interaction is very important, how they move, how they interact, how they change, what are the critical periods, those transformatory moments in which some of those trends are dying and some other trends are reinforced and so on. By the way, there is a paradox in Eastern Europe. It's no wonder that people studying Eastern Europe are struggling with those issues. Because the paradox is that the continuity is more important in the condition of institutional discontinuity. Right? In stable places like, you know, West European states, change is taking place as a constant adjustment. You know, the small things change, the rules of the institutional game change. You know, the institutionalists who study Western Europe make that point over and over again. There are no dramatic changes. You have everything evolves in. Now, it's very difficult to spot long-term continuity in the situation of evolutionary change. Now, the moment you have this dramatic discontinuity, as you have with the communist regimes, then you can see that suddenly, you know, there are those things surviving, like those grandparents of entrepreneurs, right? So Eastern Europe is actually a very interesting place to do it. And finally, of course, we need to think seriously about mechanisms, right? What are those things which really, you know, make the transmission possible? And again, you know, there's a lot of possibilities. There may be educational systems which sort of, you know, carry certain ideas, ways of thinking, and institutional memories. This may take place in families, in informal context, and so on. But that somehow is the agenda, and I think judging from the amount of work which is done today in political science and political sociology on legacies of different kind, I think this is the agenda which is going to be with us for quite an extended period of time. Thank you for your attention.